Okay, so today I'm going to talk a little about my coloring process and specifically how I pick colors and just a few things to watch out for when I am picking colors. Specifically, it's going to be about why I prefer the triangle color picker over the square color picker. I'm also going to be talking about a little about color chroma and how it translates into you picking colors and kind of things you should watch out for, and really just in general how to read the color picker to be intentional with your colors. So I definitely prefer the triangle over the square, and in Photoshop I'm using the colorist plugin to get that triangle color picker because it's just what I prefer, but you are welcome to use whatever you'd like. I know Clip Studio Paint also has one. Psy is lacking one, but I'm sure a lot of programs that people use, they have this available to them. The other last thing I am going to touch up on is the 50% to black rule and how I use that to pick my shadows. So that's really it. So I'm gonna pull up the two color pickers here, the square and rectangle, and we're just gonna kind of illustrate how they're laid out. So if we look at the triangle color picker, we have our vertical, which is our value, right? At the top is white, and at the bottom we have black, and our full black to white value range. And we're going to label that with a V. And then on our horizontal, it's very easy to tell that that is our saturation. And I'm just going to write, actually, I'll just write saturation. And it's pretty straightforward for the triangle color wheel. However, if we move on to the square, it's a little more confusing, a little less intuitive, right? So we still have our values on the vertical. It's pretty easy to notice. However, on the bottom, it's all darks. It's all black. It's kind of black all the way across. So is this our saturation? No, I wouldn't say that's accurate to our definition of our saturation there. So in that case, is it on a diagonal? Is that our saturation? Right? So you can assume that. We can assume that right now and use that as an example just because um when you're looking at the square color picker, how do you really adjust your saturation? You kind of just I think most people kind of just guess along this curved diagonal line where similar valued colors would be. And so if we I'm struggling to draw this line. Yeah, if we use this example with the most saturated color in the top corner and the darkest on the bottom corner, and we pick some colors to compare. So if I go back to my triangle color picker and I take that red, the most saturated red, and I put it down and I start going directly horizontally across the color picker, the triangle color picker, because at that horizontal we know that our value should be constant, right, based on this graph. So if I just go straight across and pick just kind of an eyeball, this should be a group of colors where all the values are consistent based on our logic so far, right? Everything along this straight line should be the same value, right? Because on this graph, it is on the same vertical. So if we switch to the square now and do the same thing, kind of with our diagonal, slightly curved diagonal, and I just pick along that diagonal, this should also be at least similar in value, right? Because that's our theory. Okay, but you can already tell that darkest gray is a little too dark. There's just no way that is the same value as the top two colors. So I'm gonna go ahead and lighten it a little, just for the sake of kind of, logically, if we were to really use the square color picker, logically it probably wouldn't go that dark. But if I Control U and I turn down the saturation slider, you can see that the triangle color wheel picked all the same values. However, the square, even though I tried to eyeball it kind of, on a diagonal, you can see that it's very different. It's quite different. Again, right? Oh, sorry, that was all the way up. There we go. So at normal saturation, basically all that I am saying here is that the triangle color picker is a little more intuitive in terms of our vertical and our horizontal. We can assume that we don't really lose, or we don't really have too much change in value when we're trying to pick a color and just desaturate it a little bit. It's very straightforward. You either go up or down. Whereas on the square, it's a little less intuitive. That's really it. So how do we apply this newfound knowledge now that we know the triangle color wheel is superior? I'm just kidding. It's not superior. But in this use case, it is the most intuitive. So we know, again, that the cornermost color is our most saturated color in terms of this color wheel. And that applies to any hue. So if I move the hue slider, which is the circle belt around the triangle, anywhere, any hue, that point on the triangle is going to be the most saturated version of that color. So if that's the case, then we know that the top triangle of this triangle is where our light colors are, right? Because that's where our light values are. And in the same manner, the bottom triangle is going to be where our dark colors are. And so knowing this, we can understand if we're going to draw a light object like white or gray hair, or a dark object, we're going to stick to those two triangles. Whereas if our object is kind of a medium valued object, we have a very wide range of colors to pick from, which is why you will mostly see more color variation in objects that are medium valued. Right? If I'm drawing a light object, I'm not going to see the colors in the middle or the bottom of the triangle in my object. If I'm drawing a dark object, I'm not going to see white, I'm not going to see the most saturated color in my dark object, because it no longer would be the same value. It no longer would be a dark object. And so this kind of illustrates that a little. So another use case for this method of picking colors is if I wanted to hide another color inside my current color. I would simply pick that color, and without changing where it is on the triangle, move it to a different color on the hue slider, the circular slider, and it logically should be the same value as long as it's on the same vertical, and I can airbrush some of that color in, right? And it should logically still be the same value. And if I look at it and I turn down my saturation, it is, right? You can kind of see the difference a little bit because of the airbrush that I used, but on the saturation slider, it is still the same value, even though when colored, it's two completely different colors. And so I can use this to very lightly hide colors inside other colors. For example, if I go to my drawing right now of my OC and I go to the earrings that I'm rendering, I can pick this shadow color, this dark red that I have as my shadow, color pick it, go to the slider, the circular belt on the outside, the hue slider. I can move it to a different color, and I can brush that color in Then, take the airbrush, brush it in. I can select that color a little, blend it in, and it should still stay in the same value group without disrupting my values too much. And you can see that that's true. It doesn't look too light or too dark. It's kind of staying in that same value range. And this is one way to kind of sneak colors into other colors and make your colors more dynamic and look more interesting without affecting your values too much. So one thing that is not mentioned here is color chroma, which I'll kind of touch up on a little later. But this does not consider color chroma. If you don't know too much about chroma, I recommend resources like books, the book by Devin Corwin. I have a Twitter thread as well about color theory and really just general art tips, and a lot of it goes over chroma because I do think it's very important. It's just not something I'm going to touch up on this video. Okay, so if we continue and we look at kind of my coloring process, here is a drawing from a class that I took, and I had to color this drawing. And if I turn off my shadows, I can kind of explain how this process went. So here I am picking the color of the hair, and this is what I'm going to use is called the 50% rule, which is 50% to black. So if I color pick the color of this hair, right, and I go to my triangle and I go halfway to black, so about the halfway midpoint, I go straight down because we're only changing the value, right? This is how to find the shadow color, the value. And I use that color. You can see that's pretty accurate to what the shadow color might be, right? I can erase it a little, clean up the edge a little. But that looks pretty solid. That looks good as a shadow value, shadow color even. And if I want the color to be a little more dynamic, I would pick that color and then just change it slightly, maybe a little more red because the color of her hat is a little more red. Oh, I forgot to lock the layer. I'm gonna lock the layer and then color it. Does that not look very accurate, right? That looks like the shadow color with a little bit of the red from her hat affecting it. And that is a very neat trick, very easy trick to pick your shadows. And I kind of apply this to almost everything. And if I wanted to have a little bit of a little edge, a little orange edge, people will do that very often. Some subsurface scattering, if you will. Then I would just, take that same color and slide it up to very saturated, and then I would airbrush it on and maybe blur it out a little bit. And you can see I use that similar method, and I tweaked the color a little bit for the final product, but that is the method I use to pick the shadows for this entire colored piece. So that is a very, very handy tip I will use. But lastly, we're just going to touch up a little bit on color chroma and why, although this method of reading saturation and adjusting your saturation, adjusting your values is very handy, why it is not completely accurate. So this is kind of a disclaimer. So using the Control U saturation slider is not a 100% foolproof way of getting a true gray, a true black and white grayscale. Why? Because we often think of colors and saturation on a 2D scale, but it is actually a 3D scale. And again, please check out resources by Devin Corwin or Marco Bucci. They talk a lot about this, but I will illustrate it here. So if I take my most saturated red and my most saturated blue and my most saturated yellow, and I pick these three colors because they are the most different in chroma, you can see that the yellow is clearly much, much, much lighter than the blue, right? And we learned this in basic art color theory that blue is the darkest, red is a medium valued color, and yellow is the lightest color in our primary colors. So even though earlier I had mentioned on the color triangle, every color on the horizontal of the most saturated color should be a 50% value, we can see with our eyes that's clearly not true. And you can see if I use the saturation slider and I slide it down, it shows that they're all the same color, even though our eyes clearly see they're not the same value at all. And that is because if I show you a true grayscale proof by going to view and let me see, this will be view proof setup, and I make a custom proof setup with working grays, you can see that this is actually a true representation of the values that each color corresponds to. And the yellow is nearly white. It is so light on the value scale that it is nearly white, whereas blue is darker and red is a medium color. And so this is actually, the true representation. And I will say that although the triangle saturation method is not completely accurate, it is very useful when constructing your drawings and really kind of planning out where your darks and your lights are going to be, and kind of double checking and making sure you're not moving too far from your darks and lights. However, in terms of true saturation, I just want to put a disclaimer out there. Please do your own research on color chroma and why, when it comes to very saturated colors or very desaturated colors, chroma plays a much bigger part in the value than you think. So keep that in mind while painting with this method. If you're going to use this method, just know it is not the only method to color. It is not the correct way to color. It is just one way to think about your colors while picking your colors. And that's really it. So lastly, I want to again introduce some other resources where you can find more materials talking about color. A lot of it would be on my Twitter thread. If you search my name, Fuwaffy, Fuwaffy, and then art resource on twitter.com, you will find my art thread about just tips in art. And a lot of it is going to be a artist and instructor called Devin Corwin. He makes extremely comprehensive threads on color theory, and specifically one about thinking about color in 3D, in a 3D space. And he uses the square color wheel and kind of explains how to read that and how we should be thinking about color. He also has an entire ebook on his Patreon, which goes into way more depth about color and values and painting. So please check that out. There's also YouTube videos. Marco Bucci makes a great series about how to pick colors, things like that. Please, don't just watch one tutorial or read one resource and make that your law, because you will definitely be missing out on a lot of insight. And that's really just the last thing I want to say. But I hope this helped someone. I hope this gives you a little more direction when you pick your colors going forward. And while it's great to just paint with your feelings and kind of be able to look at a drawing and be like, oh yeah, this looks correct, and not really know why, it is good to be more intentional with your choices. I think it's a very important part of learning, is to be intentional. So yeah, I hope that helps. Good luck, everyone.